The notification sound from my phone cut through the silence of my apartment at 11:47 p.m. I was already in bed, scrolling mindlessly through social media, trying to forget that my 28th birthday had come and gone without a single call from the man who was supposed to remember it most. But there it was. A text from Dad. My heart jumped for a second, thinking maybe he'd finally remembered. Maybe there was still time for a belated birthday wish. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Instead, the message read, "Hey Emma, can you lend me $3,000? Emergency situation. We'll pay back soon." Not, "Happy birthday." Not, "Sorry I missed your special day." Just a request for money, sent 3 hours before my birthday officially ended. I stared at that text until the words blurred together. $3,000. The same amount I'd been saving for months to finally take that photography course I'd been dreaming about. The same amount that represented countless overtime shifts at the marketing firm, where I spent my days creating campaigns for other people's dreams while mine collected dust. This wasn't the first time Dad had asked for money. It wasn't even the second or third. Over the past 2 years, since Mom passed away, these requests had become as regular as the changing seasons. $200 here for car repairs. $500 there for unexpected bills. $800 for what he called urgent medical expenses that I later discovered were gambling debts. But this time felt different. This time, he'd managed to forget the one day that had always been sacred between us. The one tradition that had survived his drinking, Mom's death, and years of strained conversations. Growing up, no matter how chaotic our household became, no matter how many times he stumbled home at 3 a.m., reeking of whiskey and broken promises, he never forgot my birthday. I remember turning 16 and finding him passed out on the kitchen floor at 6 a.m., still clutching a poorly wrapped jewelry box containing a silver bracelet that probably cost him his last $20. When I helped him to the couch, his first words weren't an apology for his condition. They were, "Happy birthday, sweetheart, I didn't forget." That bracelet sat in my jewelry box for years, a tangible reminder that somewhere beneath all his problems, there was still a father who loved me enough to remember what mattered. But apparently, that father had finally disappeared completely. I set my phone down and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the city lights that never seemed to sleep. My reflection stared back at me, 28 years old, successful by most people's standards, living in a decent apartment in Portland, Oregon, with a job that paid the bills and left enough over for Dad's frequent emergencies. Yet I felt more alone than I had since Mom's funeral. The thing about having an alcoholic parent is that you become an expert at managing disappointment. You learn to lower your expectations until they're practically underground. You celebrate the small victories, a sober phone call, showing up to dinner on time, remembering to ask about your job interview. You convince yourself that these crumbs of normal parental behavior are enough. But birthdays were different. Birthdays were our thing. When I was 7, he took me to Chuck E. Cheese even though money was tight. When I turned 12, he somehow managed to get tickets to see the traveling Broadway show I'd been obsessing over, even though he fell asleep during the second act. At 18, when I graduated high school, he showed up drunk to my birthday party but sobered up long enough to give a speech about how proud he was of the woman I was becoming. Even last year, just 6 months after Mom's funeral, when we could barely stand to be in the same room because grief had made us both sharp and unpredictable, he called at exactly 7:23 a.m., the time I was born, to sing an off-key rendition of Happy Birthday that made me cry into my coffee. But this year, nothing, radio silence until he needed something from me. I pulled up our text history, scrolling back through months of conversations that had devolved into a depressing pattern. Him asking for money, me asking questions about what the money was for, him giving vague answers, me eventually sending the money anyway, because the alternative, letting him lose his apartment or get evicted or whatever crisis he claimed to be facing, seemed worse than enabling him. The last real conversation we'd had was 3 weeks ago, when I'd suggested he try AA again. He'd gotten defensive, claimed he wasn't drinking as much as I thought, and then launched into a lecture about how I didn't understand the pressure he was under. The conversation ended with him hanging up on me, and neither of us had called since. Looking at those messages now, I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd asked me how I was doing. Really asked, not just as a perfunctory greeting before launching into his latest financial emergency. When was the last time he'd remembered something important to me that wasn't related to money? When was the last time he'd acted like a father instead of just someone who occasionally needed a bailout? The notification sound chimed again. Another text from Dad. Emma? Did you get my message? This is really urgent. Quote. I could picture him pacing around his small apartment, probably panicking about whatever mess he'd gotten himself into this time. Part of me, the part that had been taking care of him emotionally since I was old enough to understand that our roles had somehow reversed, wanted to call him immediately and ask what was wrong. That part of me had been conditioned through years of crises, both real and manufactured, to drop everything whenever he needed help. But a larger part of me, the part that had just spent her birthday alone because her father couldn't be bothered to remember it, was finally tired of being treated like an ATM with emotions. I thought about Mom and what she would have said about this situation. She'd always been the buffer between Dad and me, the one who made excuses for his behavior while simultaneously protecting me from the worst of it. She'd probably tell me to be patient, to remember that grief affects everyone differently, to give him the benefit of the doubt. But Mom had also been the one to pull me aside on my last birthday and tell me something I'd never forgotten. Emma, honey, I know your father loves you, but love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect. Don't let anyone, not even family, treat you like you're disposable. At the time, I thought she was talking about boyfriends or future relationships. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to prepare me for this exact moment. My laptop was sitting open on my dining table, and almost without conscious thought, I found myself walking over to it. Instead of responding to Dad's texts, I opened a new document and started typing. Not a message to him. Something else entirely. Something that had been building inside me for months, maybe years, but had crystallized in the space between his request for money and his complete oblivion about what day it was. I wrote about birthdays and broken promises, about the difference between being someone's daughter and being someone's safety net, about the exhaustion that comes from loving someone who only seems to remember you exist when they need something. The words poured out of me like water through a broken dam, 3 years' worth of frustration and disappointment and grief finally finding their way onto the page. It wasn't pretty or polished. It was raw and honest and probably too emotional to ever show anyone. But it felt necessary. Like something I needed to say, even if no one would ever hear it. When I finally stopped typing, it was past 1 a.m., and Dad had sent 2 more increasingly frantic texts about the urgency of his situation. I closed my laptop without reading what I'd written, too emotionally drained to process my own words. Tomorrow, I would have to decide what to do about Dad's request. Tomorrow, I would have to figure out how to move forward with a relationship that felt increasingly one-sided. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I'd put my own feelings first. And somehow, that felt like the most important birthday gift I could have given myself. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls and a voicemail that made my stomach drop. Dad's voice was shaky, desperate in a way I'd only heard twice before. Once when Mom was rushed to the emergency room, and once when he'd lost his job at the auto shop 3 years ago. Emma, please call me back. I know you're upset about something, but this can't wait. They're going to shut off my electricity today if I don't pay, and my landlord is threatening eviction. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. The rational part of my mind immediately started calculating. If his electricity was being shut off, that meant he hadn't paid his bill in months. If his landlord was threatening eviction, he was probably behind on rent too. $3,000 wouldn't solve these problems. It would barely buy him breathing room before the next crisis hit. But the daughter part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to fix Dad's emergencies, was already reaching for my phone to call him back. I stopped myself. Instead, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, forcing myself to think clearly before reacting. This was exactly how it always went. Dad would create urgency, panic, a sense that everything would fall apart if I didn't help immediately. And I would scramble to fix it, sending money I couldn't really afford to spare, only to have the same conversation a few months later. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Rachel. How was your birthday dinner? Did your dad like the restaurant you picked? I stared at the message, realizing I'd completely forgotten to cancel our plans. Rachel had been excited about meeting Dad for the first time, had even bought a new dress for the occasion. Instead, I'd spent my birthday alone while Dad had presumably been dealing with whatever financial crisis had led to his loan request. I called Rachel instead of texting back. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright with anticipation. "So? How did it go? I've been dying to hear about it." "He didn't show up," I said, the words coming out flatter than I intended. "Actually, he forgot it was my birthday entirely." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Emma," Rachel finally said, her voice careful and controlled in that way people use when they're trying not to say something they'll regret. "Please tell me you're joking." "I wish I was, but wait, it gets better. He texted me at midnight asking for $3,000. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." "Are you fucking kidding me?" Rachel had never liked Dad, though she'd been diplomatic about it for my sake. She'd met him exactly once at Mom's funeral, where he'd shown up 20 minutes late and spent most of the service checking his phone. Later, she'd pulled me aside and asked if I was okay, if I had somewhere else to stay, if I needed anything. At the time, I'd been grateful for her concern, but also defensive of Dad's grief. Now I wondered if she'd seen something I'd been too close to recognize. "I know how this sounds," I started, but Rachel cut me off. "No, Emma, you know how this sounds too. This isn't about the money, and it's not about your birthday. This is about the fact that your father treats you like a bank account with legs." Her words hit harder than they should have because they echoed thoughts I'd been having but hadn't been brave enough to voice. "He's struggling," I said weakly. Since your mom died, you've been his personal ATM," Rachel interrupted. "And I've watched you make excuses for him while you work overtime to fund his problems. When was the last time he asked how you were doing? When was the last time he remembered something important to you that didn't involve money?" I wanted to argue with her, to defend Dad the way I always did, but sitting there in my quiet apartment, with his increasingly frantic texts piling up on my phone, I couldn't think of a single example that would prove her wrong. After we hung up, I found myself walking to my bedroom closet and pulling out a shoebox I kept on the top shelf. Inside were years of birthday cards from Dad, handwritten notes that had become increasingly brief over time, but evidence that this day had once mattered to him. The earliest ones were elaborate, filled with inside jokes and memories. "To my favorite photographer," read one from when I was 15 and obsessed with my new camera. "Remember when you made me pose for pictures at the zoo for 3 hours? I complained then, but I still have every single photo. Love, Dad." Another from my college graduation. "Emma, I know I haven't always been the father you deserved, but watching you walk across that stage yesterday was the proudest moment of my life. You did that all on your own, and I can't wait to see what you accomplish next." The cards from recent years were different. Generic, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Hope your day is special." No personal touches, no references to my life or interests. They felt like obligations fulfilled, rather than genuine expressions of love. I put the box away and sat on my bed, finally allowing myself to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding for months. The father who had written those early cards, the one who remembered my dreams and celebrated my achievements, was disappearing. Maybe he'd been disappearing for years, so gradually that I'd adjusted to each small loss without recognizing the bigger pattern. My phone rang. Dad again. This time, I answered. "Emma, thank God, I've been trying to reach you all morning." His voice was breathless, panicked, and for a moment I felt that familiar surge of anxiety that came with his crises. But underneath it, I heard something else. Expectation. He expected me to fix this, just like I always did. "Dad," I said carefully, "do you know what yesterday was?" There was a pause, a long enough pause that I knew he was trying to figure out what the right answer was, rather than actually remembering. Did I miss something important?" he finally asked. The question broke something inside me. Not, "It was your birthday, I'm so sorry." Not even a guess, just a vague acknowledgement that he might have forgotten something, delivered in the same tone he might use to ask if he'd missed a dentist appointment. It was my birthday, Dad, my 28th birthday. Another pause. Then, oh shit, Emma, I'm so sorry. I've been so stressed about this money situation, I completely lost track of. You lost track, I repeated, on your daughter's birthday. I know, I'm a terrible father. But Emma, I promise I'll make it up to you. As soon as I get through this crisis, we'll have a proper celebration. But right now, I really need the money. You need the money. Yes, I know the timing is awful, but this can't wait. If I don't pay my landlord today, I'll be homeless by Friday. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every similar conversation we'd had over the past 2 years. The pattern was always the same. Dad would create or stumble into a crisis, present it as urgent and catastrophic, promise to make changes or show more appreciation, or be a better father once the immediate problem was solved. I would send money, he would disappear for a few weeks, and then the cycle would repeat. Dad, I said slowly, what happened to the $800 I sent you 2 months ago? You said that was for emergency medical bills. That was for medical bills, he said quickly. But then other things came up, and... What medical bills? What doctor? What hospital? Emma, does it matter right now? I'm about to lose my apartment. It matters to me. It matters because I've been sending you money for 2 years, and nothing ever gets better. It matters because you forgot my birthday but remembered my bank account. That's not fair, he said, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his voice. You know I love you. You know I appreciate everything you do for me. Do I? Because lately, it feels like you only remember I exist when you need something. The conversation spiraled from there. Dad alternated between guilt trips and promises, between minimizing his problems and catastrophizing them, between claiming he barely ever asked for help and admitting that maybe he'd been asking too often. It was exhausting and familiar and ultimately pointless. When I finally hung up, I realized I hadn't promised him anything. For the first time in years, I'd ended one of these conversations without committing to send money. And instead of relief, I felt scared. What if he really did lose his apartment? What if something terrible happened because I hadn't helped? What if this was the time his crisis was actually as serious as he claimed? But then I thought about Rachel's words, about the pattern I'd been enabling, about the father who used to remember my birthday. And I realized that maybe the scariest thing wasn't what might happen if I stopped helping. Maybe the scariest thing was what had already happened because I kept helping without asking for anything in return. That afternoon, I sat down at my laptop and opened the document I'd written the night before. Reading my own words back was painful but clarifying. I could see my relationship with Dad laid out in brutal honesty. The gradual erosion of boundaries, the way his problems had become my problems, the exhausting cycle of crisis and rescue that had replaced any genuine connection between us. And for the first time, I began to formulate a plan that didn't involve sending money. The plan started forming while I was organizing Mom's old recipes that weekend. I'd been putting off going through her things for almost 3 years, but something about the conversation with Dad had triggered a need to connect with her memory in a more tangible way. Hidden between her recipe cards for chocolate chip cookies and her famous lasagna, I found a letter she'd written but never sent. The envelope was addressed to Dad in her careful handwriting, dated just 2 months before she died. My hands shook as I opened it. Michael, it began, I've started this letter a dozen times and never had the courage to give it to you, but I need you to understand something before I'm gone. Emma is not your safety net. She's your daughter, and the difference between those two things is everything. I had to put the letter down and walk away. When I came back an hour later, my eyes were dry enough to read the rest. I know you love her. I know you're scared of losing her like you're going to lose me. But love without boundaries isn't love. It's need disguised as affection. Emma will take care of you because that's who she is. She'll sacrifice her own dreams, her own money, her own happiness to make sure you're okay. She'll do it because she loves you, not because it's right or healthy or fair. I'm not going to be here to protect her from that impulse anymore. So I'm asking you, as someone who loves you both, to protect her from it yourself. Don't let your problems become her problems. Don't let your emergencies become her obligations. Let her be your daughter, not your savior. I've watched you struggle with alcohol, with money, with responsibility for 15 years. I've made excuses for you. covered for you, enabled you because I thought that's what love meant. But enabling someone isn't loving them. It's just postponing the inevitable reckoning while everyone gets hurt. Emma deserves better than to spend her life fixing problems she didn't create. And you deserve better than to be the kind of father who needs fixing. I hope you never have to read this letter. I hope somehow we figure out how to break these patterns while I'm still here to help. But if you are reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably turning to Emma for the support you used to get from me. Please, for both your sakes, don't. The letter was signed with a shaky signature and a postscript. I've put aside some money for Emma in a separate account. It's enough for her photography course and a little extra. Please don't tell her about it until she's ready to use it for herself, not for someone else's emergency. I sat in Mom's old kitchen chair and cried harder than I had since her funeral, not just for missing her, but for the clarity her words brought to my situation with Dad. She'd seen exactly what was happening. She'd tried to prevent it, and somehow, even from beyond the grave, she was still trying to protect me. The money she'd mentioned was news to me. I called the bank she'd used, and after providing all the necessary documentation, discovered she'd been right. There was an account in my name with $4,200 in it, enough for the photography course and some equipment, with a note attached that simply said, "For Emma's dreams, not Emma's obligations." That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Instead of sending Dad money, I was going to send him something else entirely. Something that might actually help in the long run, even if it caused more problems in the short term. I spent 3 hours crafting what I came to think of as the letter. Not an angry rant or an ultimatum, but a careful, honest explanation of how our relationship had changed and what needed to happen for it to continue. I wrote about boundaries and expectations, about love versus enabling, about the difference between helping someone and being responsible for them. But more than that, I wrote about Mom's letter and what it had taught me about the patterns we'd fallen into. I wrote about how his financial crises had become my financial crises, how his problems had become my problems, how somewhere along the way I'd stopped being his daughter and started being his solution. Dad, I wrote, I love you, I will always love you, but I can't keep being your emergency contact for every crisis. I can't keep sending money that doesn't solve the underlying problems. And I can't keep pretending that this dynamic is healthy for either of us. I know you're scared. I know losing Mom changed everything for you. But it changed everything for me too. And I've been so busy taking care of you that I haven't had space to grieve or grow or figure out who I am without her either. So instead of the $3,000 you asked for, I'm sending you something different. I'm sending you the information for 3 different resources that might actually help. A grief counselor who specializes in addiction issues, an A meeting schedule for your area, and the contact information for a financial counselor who works on sliding scale fees. I'm also sending you a gift card for $200 worth of groceries, because I do want to help with immediate needs. But that's where my financial assistance ends, at least for now. This isn't punishment, Dad. This is love with boundaries. This is me trying to save our relationship before it becomes nothing but transactions. This is me hoping that someday you'll call me just to see how I'm doing, not because you need something from me. I know this probably isn't what you want to hear right now. I know you're scared about your apartment and your bills and everything else, but I'm scared too. I'm scared that if we keep going like this, I'll wake up one day and realize I don't have a father anymore, just someone who treats me like a bank. I want more than that for both of us. I want to be able to talk to you about my life, my dreams, my problems. I want you to remember my birthday not because you have to, but because you want to celebrate the person I've become. I want us to have a relationship that's based on genuine connection, not just crisis management. That can't happen as long as I'm enabling patterns that aren't working for either of us. I'm not abandoning you, Dad, but I am changing the rules of how we relate to each other. If you're ready to do the hard work of addressing the real issues in your life, I'll be here to support you emotionally every step of the way, but I won't be your ATM anymore. The choice of what happens next is yours. I printed the letter and put it in an envelope along with the resource information and the grocery gift card. Then I drove to the post office before I could change my mind. Sending that letter felt like jumping off a cliff. Every parental conditioning I'd ever received screamed that I was being selfish, cruel, abandoning him in his time of need. The guilt was overwhelming, a physical weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. But underneath the guilt was something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that maybe this would be the shock Dad needed to actually address his problems instead of just managing them from crisis to crisis. Hope that maybe we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect instead of one-sided obligation. Hope that maybe I could finally start living my own life instead of constantly reacting to his. The hardest part was waiting. Dad called 6 times that first day after the letter arrived, leaving increasingly angry voicemails that oscillated between hurt and fury. He couldn't understand why I was punishing him, why I was being so cruel when he was desperate. I didn't answer the calls. I'd said everything I needed to say in the letter. Rachel came over that evening with wine and takeout, and I told her everything. About Mom's letter, about the money she'd left, about my decision to send resources instead of cash. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "I know this feels scary, but this is the first time in years you've put yourself first. That's not selfish. That's necessary. What if he loses his apartment? What if something terrible happens because I didn't help?" "Emma," Rachel said gently, "what terrible things have already happened because you did help? How much of your own life have you put on hold to manage his crises? How much money have you sent that didn't actually solve anything?" She was right, but knowing she was right didn't make the guilt easier to bear. That night, I used some of Mom's money to register for the photography course I'd been dreaming about for 2 years. It felt both liberating and terrifying, like I was finally claiming space for my own dreams while potentially watching my relationship with Dad fall apart. But for the first time in a long time, I was choosing my own future over someone else's crisis. And despite the fear and guilt, that choice felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. The silence lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of no phone calls, no desperate texts, no manufactured emergencies requiring immediate financial intervention. It was the longest stretch I could remember going without contact from Dad, and the quiet felt both peaceful and ominous. I threw myself into the photography course, surprising myself with how much I'd missed having something that was entirely mine. The instructor, a weathered woman named Margaret, who'd spent decades documenting social movements, had a way of pushing students to see beyond the obvious. "A camera doesn't just capture what's there," she'd say. "It reveals what you choose to notice." During our 3rd class, focused on portrait photography, she assigned us to photograph someone who had influenced our life in ways we were still discovering. Most students planned to shoot family members or mentors. I found myself thinking about Mom, about the letters she'd never sent, about how her influence was still shaping my decisions 3 years after her death. But I also found myself thinking about Dad in a way I hadn't in years, not as a crisis to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as a complex person whose own story had shaped both his struggles and mine. That's when the first letter arrived. Not a text or a voicemail, but an actual handwritten letter, delivered to my mailbox like something from another era. Dad's handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably his. "Emma," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me right now. I know I screwed up, and I know you're angry. But I need you to understand something. I never meant for things to get this bad between us. When your mother got sick, I fell apart. You know that. What you might not know is how completely I fell apart. I stopped paying attention to anything that wasn't directly related to her care. Bills piled up, problems accumulated, and by the time she died, I was drowning in a mess I'd created by neglecting everything else. You stepped in because that's who you are. You fixed things because I couldn't. And somewhere along the way, I started depending on that instead of learning to fix things myself. I got your letter. I read it probably 20 times. And I hated every word of it because every word was true. I went to the grief counselor you recommended, Dr. Patricia Hendricks. I've seen her 4 times now. She says I've been using you as what she calls an emotional crutch, letting you carry responsibilities that should be mine so I don't have to face how badly I've been handling my own life. She also says that forgetting your birthday wasn't really about being stressed or distracted. It was about being so focused on my own needs that I couldn't see anyone else's, even yours. I don't know how to make up for that, Emma. I don't know how to undo 3 years of treating you like a solution instead of a daughter. but I want to try. I also want you to know that I didn't lose my apartment. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who I've barely spoken to in 2 years, offered to lend me money when she saw the eviction notice. Turns out she's been watching me struggle and wanted to help, but didn't know how to offer. We worked out a payment plan that I can actually manage. I'm telling you this not to make you feel bad about not helping, but to show you that there were other solutions I never looked for, because I always knew you'd bail me out. I joined AA again, meeting every Tuesday at St. Mark's. I'm not ready to count days sober yet, but I'm ready to admit I need help with more than just money. I know this doesn't fix everything. I know one letter can't undo years of damage, but I wanted you to know that your letter didn't fall on deaf ears, even if it took me a while to stop being angry enough to really hear it. Love, Dad. P.S. I know this is 3 weeks late, but happy birthday, sweetheart. I'm sorry I forgot. I'm sorry for a lot of things. I read the letter sitting in my car outside the community center where my photography class met, and I cried so hard I had to reschedule my evening plans. These weren't the tears of frustration and disappointment I'd grown accustomed to. These were tears of something I'd almost given up on. Possibility. But I'd learned enough about Dad's patterns to be cautiously optimistic rather than immediately relieved. Words were easy. Follow-through was harder. I decided not to respond immediately. Instead, I focused on my photography project, spending the weekend in Mom's old neighborhood, taking pictures of places that had shaped my childhood. The ice cream shop where she'd taken me after bad days at school. The park where Dad had taught me to ride a bike during one of his sober stretches. The library where I'd hidden when their fighting got too loud. Looking at these places through a camera lens, I began to see them differently. Not just as backdrops to my childhood trauma, but as evidence of the complex, imperfect love that had shaped me. The park wasn't just where Dad had been patient and present. It was proof that he was capable of being patient and present, even if he didn't always choose to be. The second letter arrived exactly 1 week after the first. Emma, it's been a month since I've had a drink. Not the longest stretch I've ever managed, but the first time I've gone to meetings consistently, instead of just when things got really bad. Dr. Hendricks says I should tell you about the work I'm doing without expecting anything in return. She says part of my problem has been treating relationships like transactions. I do this, so you should do that. Apparently recovery means learning to change because it's right, not because it gets me something I want. So here's what I'm doing, not because I expect you to forgive me or start sending money again, but because I want you to know I'm taking this seriously. I'm working with a financial counselor named James Rodriguez. He's helping me create a budget and payment plans for my debts. Turns out I owe a lot less than I thought I did. I was just managing it badly and panicking instead of making plans. I got a part-time job at Henderson's hardware store. It's not much, but it's steady income that doesn't depend on my mood or my sobriety. Mr. Henderson knew your mother from church, and when I told him I was trying to get my life together, he said she'd mentioned once that I was good with fixing things when I put my mind to it. I'm also trying to understand why I forgot your birthday. Dr. Hendricks says it probably wasn't really about forgetting. It was about being so consumed with my own problems that I couldn't see beyond them. She calls it crisis tunnel vision. I get so focused on whatever emergency I'm facing that everything else, even the people I love most, becomes invisible. That's not an excuse, just an explanation, and understanding why I did it is the first step toward making sure it doesn't happen again. I want to call you, but Dr. Hendricks says I should let you decide when you're ready for that conversation. She says part of respecting boundaries is not pushing against them, even when waiting is uncomfortable. So I'm waiting, and working, and hoping that someday you'll be willing to see if we can build something better than what we had. I love you, Emma. Not because of what you can do for me, but because of who you are. Dad, this letter hit differently than the first. The specifics, the counselor's name, the job at Henderson's Hardware, the concrete steps he was taking, felt real in a way his previous promises never had. But what struck me most was the tone. For the first time in years, Dad was talking to me like I was a person with my own feelings and needs, not just an audience for his problems. I showed both letters to Rachel over dinner that Friday. She read them carefully, then set them aside with a thoughtful expression. "How do you feel?" she asked. Confused, I admitted. Hopeful but scared. Like maybe he's finally getting it, but also, like, I've been here before and had my hopes crushed. The difference, Rachel said slowly, is that this time he's not asking you for anything. He's not making promises contingent on your response. He's just doing the work. She was right. Dad's previous apologies had always come with implicit or explicit requests. For money, for forgiveness, for another chance to disappoint me. These letters felt different. They felt like progress reports rather than negotiations. "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "But for the first time in years, I feel like I have space to think about it without being pressured into a decision." That weekend, I finished my photography project. 24 portraits of places that had shaped me, each one revealing something I hadn't noticed before. Looking at the final collection, I realized I'd unconsciously created a story, my story, that included both the pain and the love that had made me who I was. On Sunday evening, I sat down and wrote my first letter back to Dad. Not a long one, but an honest one. "Dad," I wrote, "I got your letters. Thank you for understanding why I needed space, and thank you for using that space to do real work instead of just waiting for me to get over it. I'm not ready to go back to the way things were, and I hope you understand that the way things were wasn't working for either of us. But I'm willing to see what we can build instead. I'd like to talk when you're ready, not about money or crises or problems that need immediate solutions. Just talk. About how we're both doing, about what we're learning, about who we want to be to each other going forward. I love you too, Dad. And for the first time in a long time, I believe that might be enough to figure this out. Emma." I mailed the letter on Monday morning, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my relationship with Dad. Curiosity about what came next, instead of dread. The first phone call happened 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening while I was editing photos from my latest assignment. When Dad's name appeared on my screen, my immediate reaction wasn't the familiar spike of anxiety wondering what crisis awaited me. Instead, I felt something closer to nervous anticipation. "Hi, Emma," he said when I answered, and there was something different in his voice, steadier, less rushed. "Is this a good time to talk?" The question itself was revolutionary. Dad hadn't asked if it was a good time to talk in years. Usually, his calls began with immediate launches into whatever emergency demanded my attention. "Yes," I said, settling back in my chair. "It's a good time." "I got your letter," he said. "I've read it about 15 times. Just like I did with the first one you sent. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to tell me there are conditions or requirements for us to have a relationship again." "There aren't conditions," I said carefully, "but there are boundaries. I need to know you understand the difference." Quote, "Dr. Hendricks has been helping me with that," he said. "Boundaries aren't walls meant to keep people out. They're guidelines meant to keep relationships healthy. Am I getting it right?" I smiled despite myself. That's exactly right. We talked for 47 minutes, not about money or crises or immediate problems, but about ordinary things that felt extraordinary after years of emergency-only communication. Dad told me about his coworkers at the hardware store, about how Mrs. Chen had become an unlikely friend, about the way AA meetings made him feel both hopeful and terrified. I told him about my photography course, about the project I'd completed, about how taking pictures was helping me see familiar things in new ways. He listened without trying to fix anything or redirect the conversation to his own problems. "Can I ask you something?" he said toward the end of the call. "Of course." "What did your mother write in that letter, the one you mentioned in yours?" I hesitated, then decided honesty was worth the risk. I read him sections of Mom's letter, watching my words land through the silence on his end of the line. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "She was protecting you," he finally said, his voice thick. "Even knowing she was dying, she was still trying to protect you from me." "She was trying to protect both of us," I corrected, "from patterns that weren't working." "I never read that letter," he said. "She never gave it to me." "But God, Emma, she was right about everything. I turned you into my safety net instead of letting you be my daughter. I made my problems your problems because it was easier than actually solving them. But you're solving them now," I pointed out. "That's what matters." I'm trying to, he said. Some days are harder than others. Last week, I caught myself reaching for my phone to call you when my car started making a weird noise. Not because I needed money, but because I wanted you to worry about it with me. Then I remembered that your job isn't to worry about my car, so I took it to a mechanic and handled it myself. How did that feel? Scary, he admitted, but also, I don't know, good? Like I was being a grown-up for the first time in years. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, processing the conversation. This version of Dad felt like someone I'd known once, but had almost forgotten existed. The father who had taught me to change a tire when I turned 16, who had stayed up all night helping me with a science project I'd procrastinated on, who had been capable of being present and engaged when he chose to be. The regular phone calls became a new routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, we'd talk for about an hour. Sometimes Dad would share updates from his recovery work, or amusing stories from the hardware store. Sometimes I'd tell him about my photography assignments or work projects. Sometimes we'd just talk about books or movies or random observations about the world. 3 months into this new pattern, Dad asked if I'd be willing to meet in person. There's something I want to show you, he said. Something I've been working on. But I understand if you're not ready for that yet. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral territory that didn't carry the weight of our complicated history. I arrived 10 minutes early and spent the time studying other customers through my camera lens, a habit I'd developed as a way to calm my nerves. Dad arrived exactly on time, which was itself notable. The man who had been chronically late to everything important in my life had apparently learned punctuality, along with his other new habits. He looked different, healthier. His eyes were clearer, his posture straighter. He'd lost some weight, and his clothes fit properly instead of hanging loose on a frame that seemed perpetually diminished by whatever crisis he was navigating. You look good, I said as he sat down across from me. I feel good, he said, different. Like I'm remembering how to be myself, instead of just reacting to problems all the time. He ordered coffee, black, no sugar, and pulled a manila envelope from his jacket pocket. Before I show you this, he said, I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything. I'm not trying to prove anything or earn anything or manipulate anything. I wanted you to see what your letter inspired me to do. Inside the envelope were pages of handwritten text. Dad's writing, but neater and more careful than his usual scrawl. It's a letter to your mother, he explained as I began to read. Dr. Hendricks suggested I write to her about the things I never got to say, the apologies I never made, the changes I never committed to while she was alive to see them. The letter was raw, honest, and devastating. Dad wrote about his drinking, about how he'd used her illness as an excuse to avoid dealing with his own problems, about how he'd transferred his dependence from alcohol to crisis-making after she died. He wrote about the ways he'd failed as a husband and father, but also about his grief and fear and the overwhelming sense of being lost without her guidance. But what struck me most was how he wrote about me. I turned Emma into you, he'd written. I made her my caretaker, my crisis manager, my emotional anchor. I treated her like she existed to solve my problems, instead of like she was a person with her own life to live. I robbed her of the chance to grieve you properly because I made my grief her responsibility too. I know you worried about this. I know you saw it starting even before you died. I wish I had listened then. I wish I had been strong enough to let Emma be your daughter instead of my replacement parent. But I'm trying to fix it now. I'm trying to learn how to be her father instead of her burden. I'm trying to earn back the right to be someone she calls because she wants to, not because she has to. When I finished reading, Dad was watching my face carefully. I know it doesn't undo anything, he said, but writing it helped me understand how far off track I'd gotten, and I wanted you to see that I finally get it. I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. Dad, I said, my voice unsteady, this is exactly what I needed to see. I have something else, he said, reaching into his other pocket, something I should have given you months ago. It was a small wrapped box, the kind jewelry comes in. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple and elegant, with a small charm in the shape of a camera. I know it's not your birthday, he said quickly. and I know one gift can't make up for forgetting it. But I saw this and thought of how you light up when you talk about photography now. I wanted to give you something that celebrated who you're becoming, not something that apologized for my mistakes. I put the bracelet on immediately, and it felt like a promise. Not from Dad to me, but from both of us to the relationship we were trying to build. "There's one more thing," Dad said as we prepared to leave. "I know this might be too much too soon, but would you be willing to have dinner with me next week? A real dinner, where we sit down and talk like normal people? I've been practicing cooking actual meals instead of just surviving on takeout and frozen dinners." "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. Walking to our cars, Dad stopped suddenly. "Emma," he said, "I want you to know that even if things had gone differently, even if you'd never sent that letter, even if I'd never gotten help, you would have been right to set boundaries with me. You would have been right to protect yourself. I don't want you to think that this outcome means you were responsible for fixing me." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're not responsible for my recovery, just like you weren't responsible for my problems. The fact that your letter motivated me to get help doesn't mean it was your job to save me. I'm saving myself. You reminded me that I was worth saving." Driving home, I realized that for the first time in years, I was looking forward to seeing my father again. Not because I felt obligated to check on him, or because I was worried about what crisis might be developing, but because I genuinely enjoyed his company. It felt like the most precious gift I'd ever received. The dinner invitation turned into something neither of us expected. Instead of meeting at a restaurant, Dad asked if I'd be willing to come to his apartment. The same apartment I'd been so worried about him losing months earlier. "I want to show you how I'm living now," he said during our Thursday call. "Not because I need approval, but because I want you to see that I'm building a life instead of just surviving one." I agreed, curious about what had changed in the space I'd only visited during emergencies and crisis interventions. Walking up to Dad's building that Saturday evening, I realized I hadn't been there in over 6 months. The last time was when he'd called, panicking about a water leak that turned out to be a minor drip he could have fixed, with a $20 part from the hardware store where he now worked. Dad met me at the building entrance, and I immediately noticed how different his energy was. Instead of the frantic, scattered demeanor I'd grown accustomed to, he seemed calm and purposeful. He was wearing a button-down shirt that actually fit him properly, and his hair was neatly trimmed. "Before we go up," he said, "I want you to know that what you're about to see isn't perfect. I'm still learning how to maintain a space properly, but it's honest. It's the life I'm actually living, not a performance for your benefit." His apartment had been transformed. Gone were the piles of unopened mail, the empty bottles hidden in corners, the general chaos that had made every previous visit feel like stepping into someone's breakdown. The space was clean, organized, and, most surprisingly, decorated with personal touches that suggested someone actually lived there intentionally. On the kitchen table was a framed photo I'd never seen before: Mom, Dad, and me at my college graduation. Dad was sober in the picture, beaming with pride, his arm around both of us. I'd forgotten that version of him existed. "Mrs. Chen helped me find that," Dad said, noticing my attention. "She said keeping good memories visible helps balance out the guilt about the bad ones." The kitchen smelled like actual cooking, garlic and herbs, and something that made my stomach rumble with anticipation. Dad had prepared what he called experimental spaghetti, admitting he'd watched 3 YouTube videos to learn how to make sauce from scratch. "It might be terrible," he warned as he served generous portions, "but it's made with actual ingredients instead of just microwaved." The sauce was actually delicious, and I told him so. Dad's face lit up with the kind of simple pleasure I hadn't seen from him in years. "Cooking is weird," he said as we ate. "It requires planning ahead, being patient, paying attention to details, all things I was terrible at when I was drinking. But now I kind of like the process. It's meditative." After dinner, Dad showed me other changes he'd made. A small desk area where he kept his budget spreadsheets and AA meeting schedules. A bookshelf with titles about addiction recovery and grief counseling, mixed in with fiction he'd started reading again. A corner where he'd set up an old exercise bike Mrs. Chen had given him when her arthritis made it too painful to use. Dr. Hendricks says routine is important for people like me, he explained. Not a rigid routine that becomes another way to avoid life, but an intentional routine that supports the life I want to have. We talked until almost midnight, and for the first time in years, neither of us watched the clock anxiously. Dad shared stories from work that had nothing to do with problems or crises. Funny interactions with customers, projects he was excited about, plans for learning new skills. I told him about a freelance photography gig I'd booked for a local magazine, about how good it felt to get paid for something I loved doing. You know what's strange? Dad said as I prepared to leave. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some crisis to emerge that will test whether all this progress is real. But so far, the only test has been ordinary life. Paying bills on time, showing up to work consistently, maintaining relationships without drama. And those things are turning out to be harder and more rewarding than I expected. How do you feel about that? I asked. Grateful, he said simply, and terrified, but mostly grateful. The following Tuesday, Dad called with unexpected news. I have a proposition for you, he said, and I want you to know up front that no is a completely acceptable answer. He explained that Henderson's Hardware was expanding their social media presence and needed someone to take photos of their products and store events. Mr. Henderson had seen some of my work that Dad had shown him and was interested in hiring me for a small project. I didn't volunteer for you, Dad said quickly. I just mentioned that you were a photographer when he was complaining about how expensive professional photos were. He asked to see your work, and I showed him the portfolio you shared with me. But I made it clear that any business discussion would have to go through you directly. I was impressed by how carefully Dad had handled the situation. The old version of him would have either committed me to the project without asking, or used it as an opportunity to insert himself into my professional life. Instead, he'd simply made an introduction and stepped back. The project with Henderson's Hardware turned into my first real commercial photography contract. Mr. Henderson was delighted with the results, and word spread to other local businesses. Within 2 months, I had enough freelance work to reduce my hours at the marketing firm and focus more seriously on building my photography career. None of this would have happened if Dad hadn't mentioned my work to his boss. But unlike his previous attempts to help my career, which usually involved him trying to solve problems I didn't have or making commitments on my behalf, this felt like genuine support offered without strings attached. I'm proud of you, Dad said when I told him about landing my third commercial client. Not because I had anything to do with it, but because you're building something that's entirely yours. 6 months after our first dinner at his apartment, Dad called with another unexpected request. I know this might sound strange, he said, but would you be willing to take some photos for me? He explained that Dr. Hendricks had suggested he create a visual record of his recovery journey. Not for anyone else to see, but as a way to mark his progress and remind himself how far he'd come. I thought maybe you could take pictures of the important places, he said. The AA meeting location, Henderson's Hardware, Mrs. Chen's apartment. Places that represent the life I'm building instead of the life I was escaping from. It was an unusual assignment, but one that felt meaningful in ways I didn't fully understand until we were walking through his neighborhood with my camera. Seeing Dad's world through a lens, I noticed things I'd missed during our dinner visits. The way he greeted other shop owners on his street. How he stopped to help Mrs. Chen carry groceries without being asked. The casual confidence with which he moved through spaces that had become familiar rather than just endured. You look happy, I said as I photographed him outside the community center where his AA meetings were held. I am happy, he said, sounding surprised by the realization. Not every day, and not about everything, but most days, yeah, I'm happy. Taking those photos taught me something important about recovery that I'd never understood before. It wasn't just about stopping destructive behaviors or solving immediate problems. It was about building a life worth living, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, day by day. And for the first time since Mom died, I could see Dad doing exactly that. My 29th birthday arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after the forgotten birthday that had changed everything between Dad and me. I woke up to 17 text messages. But this time, they weren't desperate requests for money. They were birthday wishes from friends, colleagues, and clients who had become part of my expanding world since I'd started taking my photography seriously. Rachel had sent a photo of an elaborate cake she'd ordered for our celebration dinner. My photography instructor, Margaret, had shared an article about grant opportunities for emerging artists. And at exactly 7:23 a.m., the time I was born, my phone rang with Dad's call. "Happy birthday, Emma," he said, his voice warm and clear. 29 years ago today, you made me a father. It's taken me this long to figure out how to actually do the job right. I laughed, surprised by how much joy I felt hearing those words. "You're doing fine, Dad. We both are." "I have something for you," he said. "Can I bring it by around noon? I know you probably have plans, but I wanted to see you on your actual birthday." When Dad arrived at my apartment, he was carrying a wrapped package that was clearly too large to be jewelry and the wrong shape to be a book. His eyes were bright with the kind of excitement I remembered from childhood birthdays when he'd been sober and present. "Before you open it," he said, "I want to tell you what it is and why I chose it." Inside the package was a professional camera bag, expensive, well-made, with compartments designed for serious photography equipment. But what made it special was what Dad had added. A small embroidered patch with Mom's initials and the words, "For Emma's Dreams." "I asked Mrs. Chen to help me with the embroidery," he explained. "She said your mother would have wanted you to have something that honored both your talent and her belief in you." I traced the embroidered letters with my finger, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "Dad, this is perfect, but it must have been expensive." "I saved it," he said proudly, "for 3 months. Every week I put aside a little money from my paycheck specifically for your birthday gift." It felt good to plan for something positive instead of just reacting to emergencies. That afternoon, Dad took me to lunch at a small restaurant I'd never been to, and over sandwiches and coffee, he told me about the changes that had happened in his life over the past year. "I got promoted at Henderson's," he said. "Not to management or anything dramatic, but Mr. Henderson asked me to train new employees. He says I have patience, and I'm good at explaining things step by step." "That's wonderful, Dad." "The weird thing is, I actually enjoy it. Teaching people, sharing what I know, being someone they can depend on for guidance. It's like I'm finally using my experience in a positive way, instead of just surviving it." He told me about his 1-year sobriety milestone, which he'd celebrated quietly with his AA group the month before. About how he'd started volunteering at a local community garden, finding peace in the routine of planting and tending and watching things grow. About his friendship with Mrs. Chen, who had become like family to him. "She makes me soup when I'm sick," he said with a smile. "And I fix things around her apartment when they break. It's nice having someone care about my daily life without any crisis attached to it." But what struck me most was how he talked about the future. For years, Dad's conversations had been focused on immediate problems or vague promises about getting his life together someday. Now he had concrete plans, realistic goals, things he was looking forward to. "I'm thinking about taking some business classes at the community college," he said. "Mr. Henderson mentioned that he might want to expand the store eventually, and I'd like to be ready if opportunities come up." After lunch, we walked through the park where he'd taught me to ride a bike 20 years earlier. The same park I'd photographed for my class project, but seeing it with Dad beside me, it looked different again. Not like a monument to complicated memories, but like a place where good things had happened and could happen again. "Emma," Dad said as we sat on a bench overlooking the pond, "I need to tell you something important." My heart jumped for a moment, conditioned by years of associating, "I need to tell you something" with incoming crises. "It's nothing bad," he said quickly, reading my expression. "I just want to make sure you understand that what happened between us this year, the changes I've made, weren't just about keeping you in my life. They were about becoming someone worthy of being yours." "What do you mean?" "I mean that even if you had decided you couldn't have a relationship with me anymore, I still would have needed to do this work. For myself. For your mother's memory. For the man I want to be, regardless of who's watching." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Recovery isn't something I'm doing to earn your love back. It's something I'm doing because I finally love myself enough to want better. Your letter didn't guilt me into changing. It showed me that change was possible." As evening approached, Dad walked me back to my apartment building, where Rachel was waiting with the elaborate birthday cake and several mutual friends who had gathered for dinner. "Before you go celebrate," Dad said, "I have one more thing." Quote, he pulled out an envelope that contained a card, handmade, with a photograph he'd taken of Mom's garden the spring before she died. Inside, in his careful handwriting, he'd written, "Emma, on your 29th birthday, I want you to know that I finally understand the difference between being your father and being your burden. Thank you for loving me enough to teach me that difference, even when it was hard. Thank you for setting boundaries that saved both of us. Thank you for giving me the chance to earn back the privilege of being proud of you. I love you, not for what you've done for me, but for who you are. Happy birthday. Love, Dad." Below that, he'd added, "P.S. I already have next year's birthday marked on my calendar." Looking back now, I realize that the moment Dad forgot my birthday and asked for a loan was actually a gift, though neither of us recognized it at the time. It was the moment that forced us both to confront what our relationship had become and decide what we wanted it to be instead. Sending him resources instead of money wasn't just about setting boundaries. It was about believing that he was capable of more than just surviving from crisis to crisis. It was about loving him enough to stop enabling the patterns that were keeping him stuck. And in the end, that leap of faith, both his willingness to accept help and my willingness to offer it differently, gave us something we'd never had before. A relationship based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than desperate need. Some stories about addiction and family dysfunction end with dramatic interventions or rock-bottom moments. Ours ended with something quieter but no less profound. Two people learning to love each other well, with boundaries that protected rather than separated, with support that empowered rather than enabled. My 29th birthday wasn't just a celebration of another year of life. It was a celebration of the family we'd chosen to become, built deliberately from the ashes of the family we used to be. And as I blew out the candles on Rachel's elaborate cake, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could do for them, I made a wish for many more years of this harder but infinitely more satisfying kind of love. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.